Okay, hooray. This is our last media of art, architecture. So when we're looking at architecture, this is our last of the 7 media we're going to go over, and our second one, which is three-dimensional. Okay, the first thing we need to know with architecture is this famous alliteration here. Form follows function. Okay, so form and art, we've talked about that a little bit here as far as our arts and distinctions in the earlier section of class. And form is the physical aspects of the work of art, whereas content is the mental part of the artwork or the meaning. And so that's what form means here. It's the physical part of the architecture. And so that could be the dimensions, the scale, the materials that are used. That is what basically form is here. And so form follows function. Function would be what the building is used for. Okay, so the form of the building is going to follow, or in large part be dictated by, the function of the building. And so as an example, we have this basketball gymnasium here. And so if you build a basketball gymnasium, you're not going to have 8-foot tall ceilings. It's not going to function that way. Okay, you're going to want ceilings that are higher, 50, 60 feet, something like that at least. And so that's what form follows function means. Okay, that the form here, in this case, the height of the building and the size of the building is going to follow the function, what it is being used for. Okay, so what we're going to look at are some different building techniques and methods. The first one is masonry. The second one is post and beam. The third one is the rounded arch, and then we'll go into the Gothic arch and vault. And then the last one that we have there is the Le Corbusier's domino construction system. And you can see with each of those we have a couple terms we need to know with each of those techniques and methods. So let's look at masonry here. Okay, with masonry we're basically piling our building material upon itself. And so most of the time that's going to be either brick or stone, something like that. And so a very early example of that would be the pyramids here at Giza. Okay, and so these have certainly stood the test of time. I believe the first one was constructed around 2600 BC, so they've been around for quite a while. And this is an example of what we would call dry masonry. With masonry, if you're familiar with like bricks, the way bricks are laid, you would lay one layer of brick down, and then in between the bricks you would have the use of a mortar, which is going to help keep the bricks stuck together. Well, with dry masonry we don't have the use of the mortar to keep it together. And so this is an example of dry masonry, that these pyramids have standed just with, or have stood all this time with just the weight of gravity and their own weight keeping them in place. And especially important in that technique is how you would be able to cut stones and how you can fit them together, which the ancient Egyptians were quite adept at. And so that's another example of a different term we need to know for masonry, something called dressed masonry. That's when the stones or the bricks are shaped or cut before they're put together. Okay, so not all masonry is like that. For instance, we have this castle example here, and you can see that the stones used aren't perfectly shaped or cut necessarily, but it's still here been enough to do the job. Okay, so those are our examples with masonry. The next one that we have is post and beam. Okay, and so this is Stonehenge. This is really one of the earliest pretty extraordinary examples of architecture here. And you can see that they have two posts connected by a beam there at the top. And so that's something that we also see with the ancient Greeks. That was a method that they used in their temples, like we see here. And this is also where materials are going to affect the structure to a certain extent. For instance, if we look at the way that the columns are located, they're pretty close to each other. And so that's because stone is very heavy. And so you can't have a really long expanse in between the columns here because eventually the architecture would collapse upon its own weight. And so that's, a pretty important part of architecture. You could design a beautiful building, but if it does not stand up, then you won't have a job as an architect for too long. And so if you notice here, the expanse between the columns are pretty short because of the heaviness of stone. If you have a lighter material like wood, you would have a longer expanse you could use probably in between your columns. And when we get to modern techniques like steel and reinforced concrete, you're really allowed to go pretty far as that expanse in between the columns that is supported or supporting a beam. What this is also an example of is something called a colonnade. Okay, that is C-O-L-O-N-N-A-D-E, colonnade. And a colonnade is a series of columns or a series of posts like we see here. And so you can see that is how the Parthenon is constructed here with these series of colonnades. Okay, here is an example of the rounded arch. And as we'll see in art history, the Romans are some very practical people. When they find something that works, they will generally run with it, and that was certainly the case with this arch here. They used the arch in a lot of forms of their construction. And so one thing about the rounded arch that is a little bit better than the post and beam is that the post and beam, the weakness is going to be where that beam is not supported by a post, so the middle section. With an arch, because of the way the arch is designed, all of those stones in that arch share equally the weight distribution of gravity, and so they all share that load-bearing responsibility that gravity puts down on it. And so because of that, it's going to be a real solid type of design to work with, and it enables the Romans to do some pretty impressive things. A lot of their structures still stand today. And so, for instance, in the top left, that picture there is known as the Pont de Garde, and it was originally built as an aqueduct just to bring water to Rome. It's in France, so you can see that they built on quite a big scale there. Okay, and another term we need to know is arcade. Just as a colonnade is a series of columns, well, an arcade is going to be a series of arches. And as we see, we have 3 levels of those arcades that are making up that Pont de Garde there, the picture in the top left. And like I mentioned earlier, the Romans are really going to do some different things with this arch. They're going to develop it in a lot of different ways, and one of those ways is seen by the picture on the top right. And that is called a barrel vault. When we have an arch that is extended into depth, that is known as a barrel vault. And if you go to even today, if you go to some kind of mountainous area and you have like a tunnel through a mountain, for instance, you probably notice that that the tunnel is built in an arch type of structure because of its the strength of the shape. Okay, so we go from the arcade there to the barrel vault, and then the picture on the bottom left is an example of a Groen vault. And a Groen vault is just when 2 barrel vaults intersect. And so you see this type of intersection in things like cathedrals, churches. Basically, Christian churches used the Roman basilica as the form of their churches, and so even today you'll see churches built with this Groen vault type style. Even homes that are built with 4 arches that are going to intersect will a lot of times have Groen vaults. On the ceiling, you'll be able to see kind of this X type of pattern that it creates. Okay, so that's Groen vault. And our last permutation of this arch, I should say, is the dome. On the bottom right there, it's an example of a dome that the Romans were able to build. by the first century, and so they were very advanced builders for sure. Okay, our next advancement here in architecture is what, without a doubt, the most impressive architectural accomplishment here throughout the Middle Ages. And this is basically the Gothic arch and vault. Okay, and so the difference with the Gothic arch as opposed to the rounded arch, the arch itself is slightly different. It comes to a point at the top. And the real revolutionary thing about this type of system here is the vaulting that is used. Okay, so this example is the Notre Dame de Paris. It's in Paris, so Notre Dame Cathedral there. And if you see the people in the foreground, you can see just how large the structure is in reference to them. And if you notice all the way around the structure, you have these little outside walls or outside support columns. Those are called buttresses. And if you notice, they have these little arms that attach the inside walls with these outside buttresses. Those are called flying buttresses because they're hanging out there in the air. And so that's what the vaulting system here for the Gothic arch is all about, these buttresses and flying buttresses. You can see on the top left picture, there's a kind of a closer example of that. You can see how the arms are attaching from the inside to the outside there. And then you see on the right here a picture of what this cathedral would look like here from the inside. And so you can see just how vertically these things are built. You can see the pointed arches, and you can see just how much of the walls are taken up by windows. And that's part of this vaulting construction, that basically distributing the load-bearing responsibility off of that wall there and putting it on that buttress is allowing for some of these amazing type of stained glass windows that we see that become such an iconic part of this type of architecture. Okay, so that's going to be definitely a good thing, especially in an era without electricity where light can flood into these structures here. Okay, so with the Gothic arch and vault, we have our buttresses and flying buttresses, and of course these stained glass windows here that appear because of that. And so materials are always going to be a big thing as far as construction. For instance, with some of the Roman construction, part of the reason they were able to build on a really large scale is the kind of rediscovery they had of concrete. It was very cheap building material that they could make a lot of, and it also has a very good strength to weight ratio, and so they were able to build a lot. And so as technology advances, we see our structures are getting larger and larger in a lot of cases. In this case, the Eiffel Tower, one of the most well-known monuments here in the world. And this was built out of cast iron, which also has a really good strength to weight ratio and allows people to build on this really massive scale here. And so that, along with the fact that more people are living in cities, and in a city it's harder to build wider, and so you would have to build taller, that really kind of leads to some of the bigger architectural feats here of modern times. And an example of that would be something like this, a modern skyscraper. Now, a technique that is used with a lot of modern skyscrapers is the last technique here we'll go over. It's something called Le Corbusier's domino construction system. Okay, and so Le Corbusier is the last name of the guy who develops it. And it's called the domino construction system because if you were to look at a structure like this from a bird's eye view, and you were able to see where the building is being supported from, you would see that it's internally supported, that there would be columns or things on the inside that would essentially support the structure. And so you can really build floor and floor and floor almost like you would build with Legos. And another thing that's going to do is the outside walls are now going to be able to be made entirely of glass. So that is something that we would call a curtain wall. here in Lake Charles, if you go downtown, you'll see our largest building is an example of that. The exterior is made almost entirely out of glass, and you can afford to do that because the walls don't have, they're not needed to support the structure because of that internal support that's going on the inside of the structure in this system of construction. Okay, so that does it for our media of art. Make sure that we review the things we need to review, and get ready here for our next test. We'll have some opportunities to review before that comes.